Good evening. My name is Miriam Udell, and I am the Judith London Evans Director of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies. And it is an absolute delight to see this lecture hall fill up with familiar and new faces of undergraduates, graduate students, faculty members, friends of the TAM Institute, community members who have all come tonight for the Tenenbaum lecture. You're going to hear more about Dr. Ayala Fader, our wonderful speaker, in just a moment. But I want to give you a quick overview of some of the exciting things that are going on in the TAM Institute as we seek to really engage our students, particularly undergraduates, beyond the boundaries of a single classroom. We have started to plan our programming a little bit more intentionally and centrally around themes. Our first theme this calendar year and going all the way through next spring is gender and reproduction. We also have a group of students who are taking a course on Jews in and Poland with Professor Eli Schenker, who will then accompany Professor Schenker on a trip to Poland during Maymester. So we're really taking the learning from the classroom all the way out into the world. And we are very excited about what we have going on with our undergraduates. We are no less excited about what we have going on with our graduate students, some of whom are in attendance, and we especially relish the rare opportunity to salute one of the world's newest PhDs, Dr. Matthew Brittingham. There was nothing to be defensive about, but he defended earlier this week. We also want to call the community's attention to the Yom HaShoah programming, the programming for Holocaust Remembrance Day that the university is planning for April 17th during the day through the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life and through the TAM Institute on the evening of April 18th. More details will be circulated soon, but we are planning an evening of reflection on the theme of Holocaust memory and distortion and an opportunity to present our visiting assistant professor in Holocaust studies and anti-Semitism to the community. I want to acknowledge that we are gathering this evening at a difficult time in Israel. Many of us are watching events unfold there with a catch in our throats and something of a tear in our eyes. It's a time of great uncertainty. And even as that unfolds and some of our hearts are in the East, it is really the power of scholarship, of sincere searching, questioning, and deliberation that helps us to continue to weave and sustain the social fabric. So it feels like we're doing something important tonight in relation to that, even if it isn't in any sort of direct relation. This lecture is able to be as large and splendid as it is because of the generosity of several co-sponsors whom we would like to thank. The Candler School of Theology, the Center for Ethics, the Department of Anthropology, the Department of German Studies, my own home department, the Department of Religion, the Graduate Division of Religion, the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the Hightower Fund, and the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life. Not only are those sponsors essential for helping to support this event, but this is actually, the Tenenbaum lectureship is not just the public lecture tonight. There is a smaller, more internal-facing event that happens tomorrow. And as you can imagine, with these two events and a visit to two classes and meetings with students, meetings with faculty, there is an enormous amount of logistical planning that goes into preparing this kind of a program. And so it is my real pleasure to thank with so much gratitude TAM Institute's Executive Director, Paul Entiff, and our Communications and Events Planner, Brent Buckley. The other person behind the scenes making all of this happen is our Tenenbaum Committee Chair, and that is my dear colleague, Professor Don Seaman, whom I will now introduce briefly so that he can introduce our speaker. Professor Seaman is jointly appointed to the TAM Institute of Jewish Studies and the Department of Religion here at Emory. He received his PhD in anthropology at Harvard, where I can tell you he was nice to undergraduates, and is co-editor of the Contemporary Anthropology of Religion book series at Palgrave. His most recent book, Hasidim, Suffering and Renewal, was published by SUNY Press in 2022. And now I will remember to do the thing I am supposed to with the tech and invite Professor Seaman.
Welcome, everybody. Is there a microphone I'm supposed to be speaking? Can people hear me? Yes. Okay, very good. So they told me I had 5 minutes, and I said no. I would take a few extra because there's a lot to say about our speaker, and I also want to orient you a little bit to what you'll hear tonight, which is not standard Jewish studies fare, but is something different and I think exciting. Dr. Ayala Fader is someone I've known for a long time. She's professor of anthropology at Fordham University. Her areas of research include the anthropology of Jews, law, ethnographic methods, language and social justice, and I'll now add public health and religion. She received her PhD in anthropology from New York University. And by the way, like me, back in a time when it was not so simple to do a PhD in anthropology having to do with Jews. And there was a lot of pushback I know that I experienced, and I think others in my generation did. And there weren't so many jobs either. So the world has changed a little bit. And that's partly thanks to the TAM Institute, which went out and searched for an anthropologist back when I came here. She's co-founder of a long-running seminar on Jewish orthodoxies at Fordham's Jewish Studies program, and she's a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research. She's the founder of the Demystifying Language Project, which is sort of contrary to everything I believe in, which works to make linguistic anthropology a social justice resource for public schools. She's written 2 books that are both award winners and very well received. Mitzvah Girls in 2009, which was about a Hasidic seminary in New York. It was a National Jewish Book Award winner, New York Society Library for Cultural Anthropology Award winner. Hidden Heretics, the book that the talk tonight will be about, which came out more recently, was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize, the National Jewish Book Award, the Jewish Schnitzer Award, Jordan's Schnitzer Award. I can tell you that these are not empty things, and not everybody gets these kinds of honors. So Professor Fader comes very well recommended by the field, and is somebody who people go out of their way to read, even who are not directly in the field of Jewish studies. The Mitzvah Girls had a tremendous impact. In religious studies more broadly, I think Hidden Heretics will as well. I recommend it. Go buy it. We're not selling it, but please buy it. Let me just tell you 1 or 2 things. Anthropology is a difficult field to describe. People think that it is about cataloging exotic cultures and customs or digging things up. The kind of anthropology that Professor Fader and I both do is not that. And even though we come from different sort of theoretical backgrounds, we've sort of converged over the years on a similar interest in conveying the complexities of human experience. The book that Professor Fader is going to present from tonight is not about Jewish theology. It's not about Jewish history. It's not even really about the culture of a certain Jewish community in New York. It's a book about the difficult and complex and ambiguous and ambivalent experiences of a group of people who have experienced what she calls life-changing doubt. And the very fact that somebody in anthropology of religion is writing about doubt rather than belief is a good thing, in my view, because she's talking about where many people live. And the kind of doubt she's describing is doubt that has changed people's lives in a very dramatic way. I think all of us have had that experience. And by the way, as I was reading her book, I was thinking that many people who have gone in the opposite direction towards religious observance have also had that kind of life-changing doubt that has led them in different directions. I think that people who are interested in Jewish education, in theology, in all sorts of fields beyond anthropology ought to be reading her book, because she spells out, or she gives us a window into a set of experiences that most of us will never have the opportunity to get to know on our own. And I can say, as somebody who does field work, the fact that she got access to the people that she's speaking to in this book is something extraordinary, right? She's on Yiddish chat rooms for women leaving Hasidism or ultra-Orthodoxy. That's not an easy place to get to. And it really bespeaks a great skill as an ethnographer, that she was able to do that. I want to invite Professor Fader up here, not to take too much more of your time. Please welcome her with a standing ovation.
Thank you so much, Don. Here, Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. No standing ovation necessary. And it's such an honor to be here today to give the Tenenbaum lecture. And it's also wonderful to spend some time sharing some of the insights from my recent book, Hidden Heretics, with you all. I'd like to begin today with a story. And it's a story of a man that I call Yisrael. And I open with this story because his experiences touch on many of the key issues that I'll be elaborating this evening. So, Yisrael grew up Hasidic in Brooklyn, where, like his peers, he spent long hours studying in yeshiva. He was an earnestly pious boy, but when he was 13, he began to have questions, what are called in Yiddish iminakashas, or questions of faith. When he asked his rabbi, though, he was told that those kinds of questions came from masturbation. So he was silent and he stopped asking. He told me he, quote, pushed all of his questions under the rug. At 18, he got married to a woman he didn't know but grew to adore, Ruchi, and they quickly had 5 kids. But when he was 29, his questions started again. And because he, like so many other Hasidic men, had started working in computers, he had access to the internet, and he began to go online, reading biblical archaeology, philosophy, and more. Late at night, when his family was asleep, he began to go on popular heretical blogs of the day, and then later in chat rooms, arguing with other posters, trying to convince himself and others that the Torah was the word of God revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, what they call Matan Torah. And then late one night on Friday and Shabbos, when his youngest was crying and he knew that turning on the mobile above her bed would calm her down, of course, ultra-Orthodox Jews don't use electricity on Shabbos, he paused. He put his hand on the switch. Yes, no, yes, no, and he turned it on. And that was when he became what many in the community call in Yiddish, Bahaltana Apikorsim. You can see that up there, hidden in the building. Bahaltana Apikorsim is the Yiddish, or hidden heretics. Those living what they call double lives, practicing publicly, even at home, but secretly with new friends, breaking Jewish law and exploring wider New York City. Despite trying to keep his new beliefs and life secret from his family, his wife, Ruchi, of course noticed, and finally she confronted him. Did he still pray? Did he even believe in God? He confessed everything to her, talking late at night in their bedroom closet so that the kids wouldn't hear. He was devastated. She was devastated, and she told me she cried for 3 days. Was her husband crazy? Would she worry her own faith glitch or slip? How could she possibly take on the responsibility for the spirituality or the ruchnius in the home, traditionally the realm of her husband? Yisrael was desperate to regain his faith, and he sought out special outreach rabbis to help, what are called kiruv rabbis, but none did. And then finally, one day, the Modesty Committee, which is like a shadowy group of self-appointed activists, called his house. They had noticed that he had recently bought a book on science for his daughter that included a section on evolution. They wanted him to sign a contract agreeing to stop going on social media, and they wanted him to go see a religious therapist who would work closely with his rabbi. He went to a number of them from fear that his kids would be expelled from school, which would have had consequences for matchmaking later on. But nothing helped. And that was when I met him, just as his world was falling apart. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and his story and how it affected his family is one of many stories in Hidden Heretics, of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are experiencing life-changing doubt, but because of their families and fear that they cannot leave, because of their families and fear of the changing world, they don't go OTD, or off the derech, off the path. They stay, and they try to figure out how to secretly build relationships and fulfill their emerging dreams and desires, even while they continue to live ultra-Orthodox lives. The internet plays a key role in their ability to stay, and the worlds they build with new friends and lovers unintentionally and intentionally may be changing Orthodoxy itself. Hidden Heretics, also sometimes called ITC or In the Closet, are part of a broader 21st century generational crisis of authority among the ultra-Orthodox. Despite an increasingly robust demographic growth, there have simultaneously been loud struggles over knowledge and truth. Hidden Heretics pose dangerous questions in this context. Who should have the authority for making individual life choices? What and who define Jewish orthodoxy or an ethical life? In short, what can Hidden Heretics' everyday struggles tell us more broadly about religious doubt and social change in the digital age? So let me begin by clarifying that doubt is inherent to all religions. In some ways, doubt defines and refines faith. Doubt is expected. It ebbs and it flows over the life cycle. Teenagers, for example, who are boundary pushers in general, ultra-Orthodox teenagers are known to break little things while they're at that age. I was told of many young people who put on makeup or ironed when you're not supposed to on Shabbos. But this is the kind of doubt that remains in individual interiors, and at a certain age, you're supposed to settle down and take things more seriously. This kind of doubt is rarely talked about, even though if it continues to bother a person, they might go and consult a rabbi or go to an inspirational lecture to get a kind of chizuk or a kind of strengthening. Most importantly, this is a kind of doubt that doesn't disrupt religious practice. People keep going. My focus in Hidden Heretics is different. It's what I call life-changing doubt. It's a kind of doubt that challenges the entire theological structure of Jewish orthodoxy. Life-changing doubt refused to stay inside, and it often led people to disrupt or stop religious practice. This is not to say that all who experienced life-changing doubt became atheists, which is actually something that I initially assumed. Instead, what I found was a continuum of life-changing doubt, which you can see here, with Yiddish, English, and Hebrew categories to account for very subtle differences. Some are what they mostly called aufgeklärt, or open-minded, meaning they just were open to reading other kinds of things and new ideas. Others were apikorsim, or skeptics, and critical of the system. There were kofrim, which are heretics, who rejected divine revelation, and then all the way over to your left, or your right, are atheists. Note that these are gendered categories. I never heard women use these terms or heard women get called them. And as I will discuss, women's life-changing doubt was often sexualized or blamed on emotional troubles. But for both men and women, life-changing doubt often led to leaving their communities to go, again, OTD or off the derech. But for those living double lives, they couldn't. They didn't want to hurt their families. They were scared to leave their communities. Some felt actually unprepared to. Men's English wasn't so good. So they stayed, like Yisrael, keeping this dramatic change a secret, even in the most intimate of domestic spaces. Of course, life-changing doubt is nothing new. There have always been members of Jewish Orthodox communities who have questions of faith. But what was different in the 21st century was that hidden heretics began to go online, and they found others to connect with. And this created an anonymous network of doubters who over time began to meet secretly once they trusted each other in person and explore forbidden worlds together, breaking Jewish laws away from their families and out in New York City. Life-changing doubt is also never just about individual change. There were familial and communal implications. Even when kept secret, life-changing doubt affected spouses, children, and over the time that I was doing research, it drew increasing attention from religious leadership, activists and religious therapists, Orthodox Jews who all try to help those with life-changing doubt get their faith back. Let me give you a little bit of broader context for who I'm going to be talking about. The numbers of those living double lives and fellow travelers are really not reliably known. I heard estimates from, there are 100 people living double lives to there are 10,000 of us worldwide. So I wouldn't trust the numbers. But what is important is, and was consistent, is they increasingly figure large in the ultra-Orthodox imagination, as do those who have gone off the derech. And I'm sure many of you have seen or read unorthodox and all of that kind of media. So there's a concern among leadership for this. This anxiety about those with doubts is despite ultra-Orthodoxy's actual continued robust demographic growth, where families have on average 9 kids. And if you follow these communities in New York and New Jersey, you know that the communities are expanding. By the early 2000s, some religious authorities began to address life-changing doubt, and they began talking about what they called a crisis of amina, or a crisis of faith. Some blamed this crisis of faith on a religious orthodoxy that had gotten too stringent, which was really a critique of Hasidism. Some blamed trauma or mental illness, in a way pathologizing life-changing doubt. And others blamed the internet, particularly smartphones, which created opportunities for private exploration and community building among those who had doubt. One point I do want to emphasize is that ultra-Orthodox Jews have never rejected new technologies or science, for that matter, as long as anything new could be redeemed through Jewish content or Jewish form. So for example, when cassette tapes first came out, they were considered, if you can remember what those are, they were considered very unkosher. But as CDs and then DVDs came, and as the popular Orthodox music industry grew, suddenly cassettes were very kosher, and there was no problem at all. In contrast, television, and again, I'll date myself, VHS, right, and DVDs, were very difficult to control in homes. And so most communities do not allow TVs at all, although, of course, some people have secret hiding places for televisions. And now with streaming, I know that all of the hidden heretics I worked with watched Shtisel way before I did, somehow. But from 2000 on to the present, really, the internet became a flashpoint for what I see as a wider crisis of authority. Those living double lives tapped into a broader generational backlash of Hasidic and yeshivish men in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s who had become frustrated and cynical for a whole host of reasons. Some of that was the political leadership, really a breakdown as rabbis struggled over succession, and a lot of splintering occurred for Hasidic groups. There are economic challenges to living in New York City. There were fewer generational opportunities, especially for men with their limited education, including fluency in English. And finally, the sexual abuse scandals really created a broader cynicism and a sense that people were not necessarily going to absolutely follow rabbinic leadership. So this broader context set the stage for many living double life who were fed up with what they called the system. Before I return to some of my findings from Hidden Heretics, I'm just going to say a few words about the methodology of anthropology, which is what anthropologists actually do, and that is called ethnography, or participant observation. So over 5 years, which is how long the research took, I followed people living double lives where they let me, online, in person, to parties, to blogs, to bars, to closed WhatsApp groups, on Facebook, and these days on Twitter and Instagram. I always was home way later than my teenage children. They were always shocked when I came home at 4 a.m. Everything was very late night after Hidden Heretics put their own kids to sleep. As I followed Hidden Heretics where they went, my ethnographic research took place on digital media and in face-to-face contacts. I had a surprising level of access, and I'm happy to talk more about that, to many Hidden Heretics because they wanted to tell their stories, to show the world and the Jewish communities that they were a part of that they were indeed ethical people. I realized midway through the research that I had to account for the perspective of religious therapists and the outreach rabbis and life coaches who all tried to help those living double lives when they were discovered. So I conducted interviews with them where I could, and I went to a religious therapist conference and to lots of workshops. Interestingly for me, and again, unexpected, I had more trouble gaining access to life coaches than anybody else. Everyone who was a life coach first agreed to talk to me and then said they didn't want to air dirty laundry. The therapists who were trained were much more willing to talk to me, and that was a surprising finding for me. One of the real challenges of this research was to protect anonymity. Anthropologists always use pseudonyms, but in this case, the consequences could be very serious if I, quote unquote, outed someone. So I do not use real names for any of the people I met, or even for the names of specific Orthodox groups, which was difficult for me because these are very particular groups, and I would have liked to have named them, and I would have liked to invoke specific people, but I was really not able to. And I've also had to change identifying neighborhoods and other personal details. I will say that while many of the Hidden Heretics I spent time with were Hasidic, not all were. And most of the therapists were ultra-Orthodox, but not Hasidic. They were yeshivish or Litvish, and they had more access to higher education. Again, anthropologists follow people they work with, and this meant that what I was studying was not a bounded community, but networks, really, of Jewish orthodoxies. And it was interesting for me. My first book project was all about one Hasidic group, Bavaver Hasidim, but this really took me through many different kinds of Jewish orthodoxies, and it made me expand what I consider to be my object of study, and it made me understand that these groups were not bounded at all. So I'm going to turn now to the topic of the internet, which is where the crisis of faith really played out. Hidden Heretics and rabbinic leaders disagreed basically on what caused life-changing doubt. So Hidden Heretics argued that the internet did not create life-changing doubt. They all claimed that it was books and libraries, which are forbidden to visit, that really led them to question and to understand and accept alternative bodies of knowledge. And all of them described secretly sneaking into the library and reading things they weren't supposed to, novels, but also different kinds of Jewish works like biblical archaeology that proved to them that certain narratives that they had been told were not true. But what everyone told me, all Hidden Heretics told me, was that the internet, particularly social media, saved them from thinking that they were actually crazy, which is a common communal explanation, or from thinking that they were alone in the world. These networks on social media and later in person create what I call a heretical counterpublic. It's a heretical public that critiqued the ultra-Orthodox religious public. First, on what was called back then, which is the early, I would say, like 2003 to 2009, the early J-blogosphere, the Jewish blogosphere, where many critiqued rabbinic leadership. And you have here something that circulated on WhatsApp. And it says here, when they will go back to station wagons, then I will go back to flip phones. And, you know, it's a real critique of the kind of materialism of Hasidic rabbinic literature. They also blogged about their personal transformation. This is a well-known blogger called Shramel. You can see his, it's the big fur hat that Hasidic men wear. And he says he's a Hasid and a heretic, a conflicted soul torn between two worlds, the world of Hasidim and the world of reason. He was a very well-known blogger, and he created a whole network of other bloggers. And then eventually people moved over to social media, like chat rooms, where there were anonymous debates happening in real time. And that built communities of like-minded questioners and skeptics, with heretics criticizing their communities asking forbidden questions, and eventually all of that spilled over into face-to-face relationships. New relationships were begun, there were romances and friendships, and people even began using language in new kinds of ways. Men became very much more fluent in English because they were reading so much. And eventually, and I'll say a little more about this later, there was a new variety of Yiddish, of Hasidic Yiddish, that began, really facilitated by the internet, but where Yiddish became a medium for expressing personal feelings. It wasn't just used for moral didactism. And it was a place to really begin to explore this new kind of Yiddish that I call enlightened Yiddish, the aesthetics of language. There was a very well-known blogger named Katla Kanya, and he created a real stir when he translated Robert Frost Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening into Yiddish. And several people, several hidden heretics wrote to me, you know, it really shook me up when I read that poem in Yiddish, and I couldn't figure that out. And I asked them why, and they said, only somebody who really knew Yiddish, one of our own, could have written that, could have translated that poem. And to see Yiddish used in that way really shook me up. For both of them actually said that. In contrast, ultra-Orthodox rabbinic leadership went from over a decade to, and this is, I don't know if you know about this, happened in 2012, the City Field Asifa in New York. That was, an Asifa is a rally against the internet. It was really one of the first times that rabbinic leadership came out publicly against the internet. Interestingly, they were originally going to ban the internet. That was the plan, but they got a lot of feedback that that really wasn't going to work. And so they began at this Asifa in City Field, where there were over 40,000 boys and men. They actually sold filtering software. So that was the beginning of the filtering of the internet and the development of kosher filters and the idea that you could kosher or make kosher your phone. But they went from over a decade from trying to blame the internet, the content of the internet. And so this is an example of that. Initially, a lot of the rabbinic talk about the internet was about pornography and blaming the internet for easy access to pornography. This is an organization, Guard Your Eyes. You can see two hands holding the eyeball. Guard Your Eyes, which was supposed to be an accountability organization where you worked with a buddy who monitored your internet use to make sure that you were not caught in the schmutz, like caught in the dirt, right? Actually, this comes from, interestingly enough, a Christian software that was then adapted for Jews. But so what I was able to trace was this transformation from a concern about the content of the internet to actually thinking that the internet changed the interiors of people. And this is the cover story of a popular magazine called Ami Magazine that blamed the internet and smartphones in particular for actually changing the interiority, the insides of people. So it wasn't so much access to pornography as there was something about the internet that was changing people, which is interesting since a lot of people also who are not ultra-Orthodox Jews believe that. So many leaders call the internet the challenge of the generation, the Nisayon Hador, and compared it to other challenges to Jewish Orthodox existence, even the Holocaust and the Spanish Inquisition. This is something that circulated on WhatsApp, comparing, of course, smartphone macht frei to Auschwitz. Another poster that circulated stated, the Holocaust burned our bodies, but the internet burns our souls. It's not uncommon for rabbinic leadership to use Holocaust rhetoric, but to me, it was an interesting conflation of those two threats to humanity, to Jewish humanity. But unlike TV, rabbis could not censor the internet or forbid it. There were too many businesses, Jewish businesses, that relied on the internet. And in fact, the internet had been a big supporter in some way. Well, not supporter, but the internet, access to the internet had supported a lot of religious life. So leadership began requiring filters, and they tied the filters to kids' acceptance to schools, called the moistus, the yeshiva system. And new businesses for filtering actually began popping up all over Jewish neighborhoods. Still, Hasidic men in particular refused to give up their smartphones. So rabbinic leadership changed their strategy, and they began to appeal to women as keepers of the home and people who reared the next generation. I went to a really interesting phone exchange event in Williamsburg where women were encouraged to bring in their smartphones, and for no fee at all, they could exchange them for a kosher flip phone, or they could have their phone filtered. And there was a real festive atmosphere. There was a bouncy castle, and kids brought and women brought their kids, and you could fill out a form. And there was an interesting moment where women sort of gave a certain amount of access to their phones there were hundreds of Hasidic men working behind the curtains to filter. It was an interesting event. There were also special anti-internet rallies for women that I was able to attend. There was actually a recent one in November against Instagram. So what's clear from all of this is that gender really shaped access to and use of technology. So let me turn to gender now. It's unsurprising that life-changing doubt would be shaped by gender, since gender difference really shapes ultra-Orthodox life in all kinds of ways. Men and women have very different reasons for life-changing doubt and opportunities for expressing it, just as they have different access to the internet and to smartphones. But let me begin with structural and generational factors. There is a real point at the point of life cycle here. At the point of marriage, ultra-Orthodox women's independence is suddenly very different. High school girls have a lot of independence. They take the subway into the city, they put on plays, they have very active social lives, but at the point of marriage, they're expected to be home. And they're expected to be taking care of the kids, and if they're not at home, their husbands want to know, not their parents, their husbands want to know why they're not. The opposite happens with men. Boys have really intense yeshiva lives from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. But at the moment of marriage, they suddenly have an incredible amount of independence. They might have a job, or they might be studying at a yeshiva for married men called a kollel, but they have much more free time, and they are in charge of their own time. I met lots of young married men just hanging out in Barnes & Noble having coffee in the afternoon and chatting. But women were really not able to do that. Men have cars. The women I was working with usually don't drive. And men have built-in religious socializing time with other men. After Shabbos, the Shabbos meal, they might go to shul and hang out with their friends. Women's worlds really shifts to home. And so there were fewer opportunities for women to actually go and have secret lives. As I'll talk about a little bit later, they managed, but it was much more difficult. Emotionally, the experience of life-changing doubt was really different for men and women as well. Men described to me the incredible sadness and loss that they experienced when they lost their faith. Many were suicidal. It was a real moment where they no longer knew how to live their lives. But women that I talked about, though they sometimes also experienced that sadness, also experienced anger. They were angry that they had given up some of their own dreams. One young woman I talked to really wanted to be a rabbi, and she couldn't. But they were angry that they had given up their dreams for something that they believed in and then had suddenly no longer did. So there were differences in emotional responses. There were differences in how rabbis and therapists, as I've alluded to, explained life-changing doubt. For women, there was always an emotional component to why they had started doubting. Many, many women who had life-changing doubt told me that rabbis and therapists said to them, you have an unhappy marriage. If you fix your marriage, you'll regain your faith. For men, there was often an intellectual explanation like, oh, you're just too intelligent, you've read too much. There's even a Yiddish word like overread, like suspiciously overread, obergeleint, where it's not that great that you've read that much. And men who were living double lives or who were hidden heretics actually even referred back to the Jewish Enlightenment and sometimes called themselves maskilim, or the original Jewish enlighteners, and said, we are the true Jews. So men were able to make a claim to Jewish religious authenticity that women were not able to. I often think of the quote from Nomi Seidman, who's a Jewish studies scholar who has written about her own leaving of her ultra-Orthodox community. She wrote, I hoped I was an intellectual, not a whore, because she was worried about that. The consequences can be very different for men and women too. Once life-changing doubt is discovered, which it very often was, women were very afraid that they would lose their children in custody cases. When there's a custody case and one of the spouses is known to have lost belief, which is the term that people use, often the whole community will support the person who has not lost, the spouse who has not lost belief. And that becomes an impossible way for women to actually gain custody, to keep custody. For the still religious spouses, there were also gender differences. Wives suddenly had to become the spiritual authority in the family, and they had to keep their husband's secrets and lie for them as well. And as Yisrael's wife, Ruchi, said, she was scared her own faith would falter. Husbands were publicly humiliated when their wives refused to conform, something that everybody noticed. One of the still religious husbands, for example, told me that when his wife started to mark her life-changing doubt through very small public acts, her skirt got like an inch shorter, his brother actually called him up, who lived in a different city, and said, "What's going on with your wife? Take care of that." So there was a lot of public observation and well-meaning surveillance. And divorce was gendered as well. Wives were often not encouraged to divorce a husband who had life-changing doubt. One woman, Hannah, that I met, who lived in Brooklyn, was sent by her neighbors and friends all the way to consult rabbis in Israel, who told her to keep up the home and make frum life easy and pleasant for her husband. And she described to me her own feelings of sadness because she couldn't keep the kind of religious home that was meaningful to her. And she had to do things like begin to make kiddush for the family because her husband couldn't or wouldn't. And men, in contrast, were more often advised by their rabbis to divorce wives who were visibly changing their practice, although divorce was suggested for nobody right away. But gender also shaped the next steps of what happened when a hidden heretic either confessed or was found out by a relative or a spouse. So let me turn now to religious therapy. When a spouse found out that somebody had that their husband or wife had life-changing doubt, the first thing that happened was that they were sent to consult a rabbi, often a kiruv rabbi, somebody who does outreach. Actually, a kiruv rabbi was originally supposed to do outreach to non-religious Jews, but since the 90s, there are kiruv rabbis, from the word karov, to bring closer. There are kiruv rabbis who do outreach to Jews who are questioning. So it's a new position. So they usually go to kiruv rabbis. Many were often then referred by those rabbis to therapists, not so much for doubt or theological discussion, but for the emotional fallout of life-changing doubt, which could be profoundly unsettling, of course. In some cases, but not all, but some, this had really negative, even dangerous consequences. For those life coaches or therapists without much training, and there were some, doubt could be pathologized. Some told me that if the emotional problems could be cured, quote, cured, then the doubt would be too. The assumption here was that faith or belief was normative and a healthy state of being. In some cases, again, not all, and rarely with therapists with formal training, care could become triangulated. That is, a rabbi, a therapist, and a patient, and sometimes even a spouse or an older sibling, could become involved in the therapeutic relationships. I went to a therapist conference where one of the panels focused on advising the assembled therapists when a rabbi should refer someone to a therapist and when a rabbi should refer to another rabbi. And the conclusion was that rabbis advise and a therapist never advises, and that rabbis address moral issues and therapists only address emotional issues. So there was a kind of dividing there. However, there could be really negative consequences for hidden heretics when the therapeutic relationship was not working as it should. And I'll tell you the story of Javi, who was perhaps one of the worst cases that I heard. She began experiencing life-changing doubt and got unsurprisingly very depressed. She wanted to make subtle changes to her life, like she didn't want to shave her head under her wig. She wanted to learn how to drive. Her husband, of course, found her texting on Shabbos, that's the classic busted scenario, and told his rabbi, who recommended another rabbi for Javi to go and see. And she went to him and told him that she felt trapped, not about her life-changing doubt, just because she had 5 kids under 5 and she didn't know what to do. And he told her her feelings and depression came from unhappiness in her marriage, and he recommended a therapist. They met in the rabbi's office, and when Javi told this therapist that she was depressed and felt trapped, he was very understanding. So she began to trust him, and then she told him that, in fact, she had doubts about her faith. And he told her very quickly that it was clear that she had bipolar disorder, and he sent her to a psychiatrist who prescribed medication 10 minutes after meeting her. So one of the ways that Javi saved herself, and she did, was that she met new friends online who shared their experiences with her and advice about which therapist to trust, which therapist she couldn't trust. And she found herself a therapist who was Jewish, but outside of the community, who worked with her and who said yes. And I interviewed her after with both of their permission, who said she was very depressed and she was very anxious, and we had to really make some decisions together. And Hidden Heretics all told me and each other that therapists were very important, because living lives as hidden heretics also always brought depression, anxiety, and therapists could help navigate between a husband and a wife and were often invaluable. So Hidden Heretics continued to advise each other on which therapists were good for them and which weren't. That is, which therapists were invested and which therapists were not invested in keeping their clients religious. So how and when and what did those living double lives actually do? How did they live their double lives? So there were two kinds of ways that they did. In public ultra-Orthodox spaces where people were living ultra-Orthodox lives, men and women pushed the envelope of appropriateness, but just enough to stay in their communities. Bodies, clothing, language. Women I met stopped shaving under their wigs, or they began wearing gray rather than beige stockings, or as I've said, their skirts got a little shorter and a little tighter. Some men began to wear a cardigan or a parka instead of a long black coat. It's forbidden for men to shave their beards, so some men began to pull it out and said they were nervous. Men's English got better. That was often a sign that there was something going on because they were reading so much. But if any of that happened too fast or too dramatically, people noticed and they took action. Siri, a young woman, told me that one day as she was going home, her neighbor called her over. She didn't mention anything about her shorter skirt or that she had taken her hat off her wig. She said, "Is everything okay? Let me know if I can help." It was a very generous, sincere offer, but she had noticed those changes, and to her, they meant that something was wrong. Not inside, but in their secret lives, that is where Hidden Heretics lived very differently. They met up in person, and they explored New York. And what surprised me the most, I thought they would explore all the different cultural options in New York. That didn't happen very much. I saw a mashup of ultra-Orthodox sensibilities and people's imaginings of secular life. They experimented with all kinds of rebellious partying. There was a lot of partying, reclaiming adolescence. Men and women met in bars. They had parties, but they often integrated these parties into the Jewish calendar. So Leil Shishi, which is Thursday, the day before Shabbos, is often a day that men hang out. So there were often Leil Shishi parties with Shabbos food, but men and women, Hidden Heretics, gathered together there. They sang together, which was forbidden. They all got high together. There was a lot of drug use. And they drank together. So it was a Jewish framework, but they were reinterpreting what that meant a little bit. There was also a lot of bourgeois leisure activities, which always interested me because in part it was about people using their bodies in different ways. One of the real rites of passage of being a hidden heretic was learning how to ride a bicycle. Luckily, City Bikes is available. People sometimes went on ski trips far away from prying eyes of neighbors. There was a lot of online explorations. There was constant formation of different book groups online with men and women talking together, exploring intellectual ideas, reading books together, supporting each other. There was a lot of exploring New York City together, but it was often Jewish New York City. Everyone went to go see Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish when it came out, and went to, there was a Yiddish festival, sing-along in Central Park. Everyone went to that also. So it was within Jewish parameters, which I found really interesting and challenging to analyze. And some, as I've also said, began writing in Yiddish online in new ways. This was mostly men. Women speak Yiddish, but not that many women write in Yiddish. And even over the course of the time that I was doing research, the accessibility of Hebrew letter keyboards really transformed writing in Yiddish. And so I see Hasidic Yiddish as having a real renaissance now. Again, instead of the kind of moral didactism that Hasidic young men were used to, like taking notes in yeshiva, listening to, taking notes in Yiddish, but working in liturgical Hebrew and Aramaic, suddenly Yiddish was used for poetry, for writing stories, for talking about current events. There's a whole host of really new, fascinating publications. There's Moment magazine, which is simply current events in Yiddish. There's the Wecker, which is a kind of more literary magazine, again in Yiddish. Some of these are not okay to get. They won't be on newsstands in Brooklyn, and sometimes people get them in brown paper packages in Amazon delivered to their doorstep to be discreet. But what all of this has done is brought a new attention among Hasidim, especially because they're the people who really speak Yiddish, to grammar and linguistic standardization, which is something that's really new and actually very exciting. There was recently a group of Frum editors, not Hidden Heretics at all, Frum editors of Yiddish publications who met together to talk about some kind of standardization of the grammar. That's unheard of. And they actually consulted with some Hidden Heretics, I heard on my WhatsApp group. But no one was supposed to know about that. My last topic that I'd like to talk about is the ethics of living a double life. So despite all of these new relationships, and there were really some serious romances that were long-term, Hidden Heretics remained spouses and they remained parents at home. And one of my arguments in the book is that families, not only individuals, are sites where ethics are lived and transmitted and changed. So at home, many Hidden Heretics tried to introduce an alternative set of ethics or moral values. The process of becoming a Hidden Heretic and living a double life meant that people's moral codes actually changed. Many of them became more progressive politically, not in everything. Feminism actually lagged a little bit from my point of view, but they really began to embrace a very different set of values: tolerance, pluralism. These were all things that they embraced and wanted to really transmit to their children. And I guess one of the most surprising things to me was a real emphasis on choice. They wanted their children to have a choice that they felt that they didn't have. And the idea of choice is, of course, not a value neutral free idea. It comes out of liberal philosophy, secular liberal values in a lot of ways, that idea of individual autonomy. But they really wanted their kids to have some kind of choice. What surprised me was they didn't necessarily want their kids to become secular Jews, something that I had expected also. And it's my own point of view that, made me really rethink my expectations there. But one person said to me, well, if my son becomes a lawyer or a doctor, that's very nice, but we'll have nothing to talk about. So they really wanted their kids to be a little more open-minded, but to stay frum, to stay religious, but maybe a different kind of religiosity. So what did they do? They didn't want to confuse their kids or get them in trouble with their schools or with a still religious parents. So they made small changes to make their children critical thinkers, to make them a little more tolerant. One man taught his daughter to use Google and then told her not to tell her school that she knew how to do that. They taught them to value diversity. One woman, Javi, had her children, this seems so small, but it's actually kind of profound, asked her children to call their cleaning person by their name instead of calling them the goita. That's the feminine for goy. So they another woman wore pajama pants sometimes to bed, or didn't put her wig on right away. And her 10-year-old son said, "I'm scared, Mommy. What's going on?" And she said, "Don't worry, it's fine. It's fine. We're home." So little by little, they accustom their kids to small changes, at least. They sometimes asked their kids to even question the authority of a teacher. One of the really fascinating parts about ultra-Orthodoxy that I think has been so successful is that there's a continuity across home and school contexts. Parents and schools are all on the same page. But one of the people living double lives said that every, was it Sukkot? No, I can't remember what holiday it was. That his kids would come home from school with an arts and crafts project that said, in a pomegranate, there are 613 seeds, just like the number of commandments. And he would say, "Bring me a pomegranate, cut it open, you count them. How many are there really?" And that seems like, why wouldn't you do that? But it was very challenging. His wife got very upset every year and left the room. And it was a bone of contention between them. The other thing is that even with matchmaking, and this was interesting too. I thought maybe at the point of matchmaking, double life parents might balk, that they might not want their kids to be in arranged marriage. So far, that hasn't happened. I've continued to track people. But what parents did do who were matchmaking for their kids was they prepared the couple in all kinds of subtle ways, both before and after the match, to have a romantic life. So, for example, they asked very particular kinds of questions to make sure, parents do this anyway who are making matches for their kids, but not only to make sure of compatibility between the families, but to make sure that the couple was compatible. One double hidden heretic prepared the apartment. The bride's family sometimes arranges the apartment for the new couple. He made sure that there were 2 love seats so that they could sit and talk. And he really tried to arrange the house to encourage a kind of intimacy. One longtime double life couple that I write about, and they were almost one of the most poignant couples that I met, each arranged a match for their oldest child. Each was deeply involved in the matchmaking, even though the spouses of the bride and groom did not know that. The whole network of hidden heretic friends were all invited and all attended the wedding, including me, because everyone was very interested to see how the reputation of these 2 people who were both hidden heretics would hold up. Like, could they make a good match? Which they did. But neither of the couple could actually go to the wedding because there was no reason that they would be invited to that wedding. So they each stood outside of the wedding during the chuppah, during the actual ceremony. One of them stood across the street and one of them stood at the far corner, and they watched what was going on. They actually watched the wedding. And for the woman who watched her boyfriend's kid getting married, she texted all of the hidden heretics during the celebration and said, "Tell me, how's it going?" She texted me. She said, "Look at his wife's diamond necklace. I helped pick that out." But there was a real poignancy there because, they were separated. And as the significant other of the hidden heretic said, I'm sad because it's a significant moment in her life and I can't be there with her. For children, however, it was very difficult. It was especially hard on teenagers because, as we all know, teenagers are very smart and they quickly figured out that something was not quite right about their parents. I write about a young woman named Leah, who I call Leah, whose mother is a hidden heretic and suggested that she might want to be interviewed by me. I wasn't quite sure why she did that, but I was happy because I had very little access to the children. And in our first conversation, I just told her that I was studying the internet and from Jews. I didn't know what she knew about her mother. In our first conversation, she got really angry and she said, "I'm sure you know about my mother." And I was unsure of what to say. And then she started to cry. So I stopped recording and we stopped the interview. And then a year later, I was very surprised that she called me. And she said, "I want to do another interview." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I want to tell people out there. I want to tell people out there living double lives that what they're doing is hurting their children. and it's upsetting to us, and we don't know what to do, and it's harming us. And so she had a mission and so I made sure to include her because it seemed like she had something very important to say. Some teenagers became more religious in response to a double life parent. Some became less and some left. At the point of leaving, people were often asked to leave their communities. What happened to the children was the critical part that rabbinic leadership paid attention to. But it could be painful when children felt that they had to protect themselves, as Leah did, from the influence of her own mother. And some people, especially boys who had a mother who was double life, just felt that their mom wasn't disciplined enough to control her baser instincts, which is, again, a very common explanation for women's life-changing doubt. So let me conclude. I'm going to tell you some of my sort of findings, and then I look forward to talking with you and having question and answer. But the first point is that the internet neither provokes nor protects against religious doubt. There were many hidden heretics who thought it did, and many who didn't. But what digital media does do is that it has affordances. Those are the physical properties, things like anonymity, immediacy of interaction. Those things did create the possibility of having a public, one that eventually came to challenge rabbis' authorities and create opportunities for new relationships. I met once with an older man who was about 60 who had life-changing doubt, and he said he sort of came of age before the internet. And he said when he wanted to meet other people and not feel so alone, he actually had to leave his neighborhood, and he went to the Jewish reading room of the New York Public Library, or he went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. He had to actually physically move. With online communication, and especially smartphones and their portability and ability to, slip that into your pocket, there are new ways for living a double life. The second point is that life-changing doubt, as long as it stays in individual interiors, was actually not that threatening to ultra-Orthodox religious authorities. And if we think back to much more famous heretics, we see that's also true. It was the publication of ideas in book and manuscripts by Spinoza, for example, that became available to others and openly questioned religious authority that ultimately got him excommunicated right in the synagogue in front of the Ark. And while hidden heretics are not Spinoza, I think they are actually changing their communities in interesting kinds of ways. There's a new category that people call Hasidish light, L-I-T-E, or modern Hasidish, which is pushing back against some of the stringencies while still embracing the aesthetics of ultra-Orthodoxy. I mean, some of the outreach, people who do outreach to those who have life-changing doubt are modern Orthodox Jews who are like, just come to our synagogue. It has everything you want. But people who grew up ultra-Orthodox and go to modern Orthodox synagogues feel they don't recognize the melodies. It doesn't feel Heimish, right? It doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't work for them. So they are creating their own category that does work for them. And then finally, when we think about ethics, we really have to go beyond the individual and think about families, because that's where ethics are reproduced and changed. It's where interactions over moral authority take place. And one person in a family dramatically changes when one person in a family dramatically changes who and what they are, that's where there are dynamics around change that are actually visible and lived. And I'll just conclude with one more story. I'm going to return to the case of Yisrael, with whom I began. At the end of my research, I went to visit Ruchi one more time in her kitchen. And she described to me, and this was several years later, how she had decided that even though his husband lost his faith, she didn't have to. She described the burden of keeping her husband's secrets and how she wanted my readers to know so she wasn't just some frummy or too strict, and she couldn't figure out why her husband couldn't have just become a little more modern and left it at that. She felt sorry for her children who had a father who was not off the derrick, but like a little crazy. She had 2 rabbinic advisors that she confided in, and they told her to think of her husband as having a, quote, funny brain. They said to her, if he had cancer, you wouldn't leave him. This is a sickness. She agreed, and of course she had 7 kids by then, from 12 to an infant, and she didn't work, and it would be publicly humiliating and harmful to the children to divorce. So she tried to make the best of it. And then as I was packing up to go with my recorder turned off, it's always where you get the most interesting data, of course, she asked me to imagine how I would feel if my husband suddenly became religious. And I did. I thought about that as I walked to the subway. I realized that he wouldn't want to eat the food that I cooked. He might want to wear different clothes and expect me to. His political and social values might change. And that these kinds of changes would separate me. They would separate both of us. People change in marriage all the time. But dramatic personal changes are important to study ethnographically. And my hope is that by studying hidden heretics, we can gain a little more insight and maybe find compassion for these moments of change. Thank you very much.
We have just a few minutes for questions, and Professor Fader will call.
Yes.
Do you think this, what you're talking about, the Jewish community, is different from what, let's say, the Amish might experience, or any close-knit, tightly enclosed community would experience? And the reaction to it, do you think it's different? You know the authority on the Amish, I guess, but do you think
I know a lot about the Amish these days, actually. No, seriously, I'm doing a project on that.
you are the authority.
No, not really.
So, and the reaction to it, is there more punishment? Is it
Yeah.
stricter?
It's a very interesting question. And of course, those two groups are often compared because they look so similar. But the Amish are interesting because they have that Rumspringa built in, right? And they only allow adults to be baptized into the community. So they have built in a time where Amish kids do their own thing for a while, and then you have to make a conscious choice to come back and become part of the community. I've heard there's all kinds of pressures that it's not as free and easy as that seems. I do think that there's a different kind of understanding of the person among at least the ultra-Orthodox Jews that I was working with, which is less willing to trust that kind of decision-making, and a sense that the road has to be a little more narrow and that you need more support, more getters, more gates to keep people in. I do think that there are changes ongoing to a lot of these communities. And even during the time I was doing my research, there were a number of therapists, religious therapists, who were speaking out against the practice of sitting Shiva for a child who left. And there were therapists who were saying, your child comes first before your religion. They were certainly kind of controversial, but they weren't kicked out and people were listening to them. And because people have large families, the chance of having somebody who might actually be questioning is larger. And many families now have somebody who is not quite right and might have a funny brain. And that has hurt matchmaking less than it used to. So I think that I caught a moment where there was a lot of anxiety around this. I have a feeling that there's an increasing flexibility around children not totally reproducing. Don't forget, this was a community who came in the 50s after the Holocaust and had this real heavy obligation to rebuild after that devastation. And so there was a sense of this is vital to our survival. I think the thriving nature has made more options, and also because this is America, there's just a kind of way that people are able to experiment and spread out further. And unlike the Amish, ultra-Orthodox Jews live in urban centers. They're very involved in the economy, in politics, in cultural life. If you go to Central Park, there are lots of ultra-Orthodox Jews rowing boats in the Central Park Lake. They go to the Museum of Natural History, but they do skip the fourth floor, which is where the dinosaurs are. Yes?
I'm curious, as outsiders, what role do we have? Do we have any application to those that are in the community and can't speak up for themselves, the children or the young girls that are getting married, not choosing how many kids they have or who they marry? Should we advocate for them, or do we kind of staying outside with objective lenses and say?
Oh, yes, sorry, I meant to repeat the question. Yes. So the question is, what's our role? Do you mean as Jews?
As anybody watching children being their agency and autonomy
Yes.
help from them?
Yeah, so the question of children and childhood is a very important one. I'm sure you all read the New York Times pieces on the yeshiva system, right? And I think that's very similar to what you're saying. Like, is it our obligation, let's say, as citizens, to make sure that every child receives a quote unquote secular education? It's a very difficult question. And I think what I think of as non-liberal childhood, that is, children who grow up in conservative religious communities, their parents are taking care of them and preparing them to participate in their communities. And, you know, especially girls actually get a pretty rigorous education, ultra-Orthodox girls. I would feel that it was hubris for me personally to say, let me help free you. From having so many children. I mean, there's a certain amount of, yes, of course, every child is socialized to participate into the communities that they are born into, but there is a certain amount of joy and beauty that women take in having many children. I think women are told it's a mitzvah, and many women believe that and get satisfaction out of that. I don't think it's anyone's role to, just the way you wouldn't go to another community and say, let me save you. I think we would have to be very, very careful with that. I mean, there are organizations that have arisen, like Footsteps, that are there, that are not-for-profit organizations that help ultra-Orthodox Jews who are questioning or leaving. I think that's a productive way. There's an organization, Yafed, that is trying to make changes to education, but Footsteps never proselytizes or goes out into the community, though there are a lot of unfair and untrue rumors that they do. And the word Footsteps sends shivers down many parents' spine. But in fact, what Footsteps does do is offer people, young people especially, who are desperate. It offers young men GEDs. It offers financial grants for people to continue their education, and sometimes social workers to help with divorce cases. So I think through those kinds of organizations is probably the most effective. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful and insightful talk. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this idea of kosher internet and what specifically that looks like. And you also referred to people making money off of the internet, this being a large source of income. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So the question is about the internet as a source of income, and also the idea of kosher phones or kosher internet. So I think the idea of koshering or making kosher the internet actually started with evangelical Christians before it came to Jews. And some of that software, as I said, was developed for Christians and conservative Catholics who didn't want access to porn. But ultra-Orthodox Jews, interestingly enough, have actually created different filtering softwares, and I'm not that great with the software part, but different filtering softwares that different communities actually tell you have to use. So just as in your rabbi will say, we eat this meat, not that meat, that's our hechsher, that's our kosher meat that we use, and not this one, or wear these stockings, don't wear these stockings. These days, people say, like, we accept Geder as our internet filter or not. There's a really interesting set of businesses that I think come out of Lakewood that is Technology Awareness Group. It's called TAG, and they've opened storefronts in Brooklyn where you can go and filter your phone. Some of the filters just remove the internet. I know that some get sent overseas where people like blot out, like there's all levels of filter. I really can't say that much more. That's as far as I go. But there's different levels of filtering. So there's certain content, like women's faces, for example, or there's like disabling Google. So it goes from the most to the least. And sometimes people, of course, do have smartphones. They have either a secret phone or they have a phone for work, a smartphone for work, and they get a dispensation from their school, from their kid's school, because you have to sign a contract. In terms of work, I mean, working in IT has been great, especially for Hasidic men who don't have GEDs, who have not really graduated from high school usually. So because you don't need formal training, you can train yourself and get a well-paying job. So in addition to lots of informal economy things that you work for yourself, like, being an accountant or being in real estate, or there's a huge, 47th Street Photo is a huge technology store owned by Hasidic Jews. They employ many, many men, and now some women too. And so it's a real avenue that ultra-Orthodox people can work in and still observe an ultra-Orthodox life.
Folks, I'm going to ask you just one more question. We have a little bit of time for informal conversation after, but Professor Fader has been at this since early today.
Sure.
When these Heretics were exploring the secular world for the first time, was there ever any exploration of individual gender, sexual identity?
That's a really good question, and especially because they sometimes call themselves in the. Oh, sorry. Yes. Was there ever during this questioning period ever a time where people living double lives explored gender or sexuality identities? I was really interested to explore that as well, especially because what I was going to say was that whole idea of in the closet, of course, borrowing from but in fact, no. And this is what I learned. I've asked a number of people this. Usually people know that they're gay or that they're queer earlier, before marriage, and most people who feel that leave. A number of people, I remember this woman said to me, Hani said, because she left because she was gay, and she said, I couldn't stay in the community. It was just too lonely to be gay in that community. There are certainly people who are gay who make matches, and in fact, the best match I ever heard was with a lesbian and a gay guy, and the matchmaker and both of their families knew they were gay, but they wanted to stay in their communities, and they each had a boyfriend and a girlfriend, but they made the match so that they could have children and stay from. Eventually, they both left too, though. So I think it's harder, you know. So everyone that I worked with was heterosexual, and now some of the people who've left actually are trans. There's been a number of people that I know who left their communities originally saying they were gay, and then like prominent Abby Stein, for example, is trans, and there's two other people who are also trans. So that is sometimes part of people's journey as they leave, but it was not part of Hidden Heretics' lives. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank everybody, the people who contributed to the funding and the students and the faculty, and especially Professor Fader for being here. There's a lot more to talk about, so come back, listen to lectures again, come to classes. Have a good night.